UX research process. Okay, this is the one. This is the ultimate mega module. We're gonna go far beyond the basics of just writing a discussion guide or study plan, because now we have a strong foundation in UX psychology and product strategy. In this module, we're gonna get into the process in depth and learn by doing. In fact, I'm gonna give you a real life job interview exercise as our starting point so we can actually think about how to plan for research as we learn the process. Learn by example, right? That's the best way. We'll cover how to dissect the problems, define research objectives, and use those puzzle pieces to formulate our questions. When we've defined some questions, we're going to talk about how and where to recruit participants for your research with some actual scripts that I'm going to give to you that you can actually use today to email participants. So print those out and frame it on the wall. And whenever we talk about participants, we have to talk about sample size, right? I know, everybody's favorite topic. I'll show some unconventional wisdom in terms of how to ensure your sample size works. And of course, once we get those pieces down, we got to talk about methods, or rather, choosing methods. I'm willing to bet at one point, you've probably Googled this exact term before: when to use which UX research methods. Am I right? You probably saw that chart from Nielsen Norman Group. It's a great start, but I'll break it down even further for you. In this module, we won't talk about methods just yet. That's coming up later. But knowing what problems you need to solve first is gonna be way more important than choosing what method you need to use. That comes later. In this module, we're also gonna learn what happens after you choose the method. Well, you gotta conduct a study. Sounds simple, right? But there's so many things we gotta prepare for, to be aware of. I'll show you the art of moderation and listening. I'll even show you how to take notes with my notes template so your team can be involved. Once you've collected the data, we have analysis. Of course. Extracting insights to make winning strategic and tactical recommendations. We'll go over ways to analyze qualitative data. Then, for any researcher or storyteller for that matter, if your recommendations go nowhere, then does your research even matter? Does it even impact? No. So I'm gonna teach you how to tell the story of our users the right way for the right audience. And all the while, throughout this whole process, I'm gonna show you how the process itself is inherently a way for you to amplify yourself as a badass UX leader. Seriously, it's a team effort, and your involving your stakeholders is paramount. And by the end of this module, you'll hopefully gain the confidence to conduct rigorous UX research, and maybe even a study plan you can refer to whenever you have a hypothetical take-home exercise for a job interview. You know, just a nice little bonus. Are you ready? Because I'm ready. Let's get it. Do it!
How does NASA organize a party? They plan it. Hey, welcome to the first lesson in Module 4. Let's learn the process by doing. I think this is the best way to understand how the step-by-step process works when planning rigorous user research. So to ground ourselves, a lot of the work will revolve around something called the study plan. In UX research, a study plan is a document that summarizes all the research details. However, it's much more than just a document with your research methodologies and procedures. It also serves as a central place to align with stakeholders on the key objectives, to align on research questions, and as a record of how the research was conducted for future reference in case anybody else wanted to know how the research was done.
It also serves as a feedback mechanism, because you will not just have one version of the draft. You're going to have multiple iterations of the draft. Change it over time. You're going to ask feedback and update it. But going back to the study plan, I'll give you a quick breakdown of the different sections of the study plan. We have the background, the problem or opportunity space, objectives, your research questions, your timeline for the project, the methodology section, which would contain your methodologies, participants, sample size, and links to the materials you're using. Include the DAISY framework in there. And finally, last but not least, your study plan should also include the procedure, aka discussion guide, aka script, aka protocol, okay? They're all the same. Procedure, discussion guide, script, protocol. You've heard different terms for them, all the same. Don't get confused. I have one in the course materials, so feel free to download the study plan template from that section if you want to follow along. So I basically included all the information on the template itself. If you ever want to use it, just delete the information that's there. Let's walk through each section really briefly. The background or the problem. This is the section where you want to talk about where did this initiative come from? Why is it happening now? Here you might want to link to relevant background documents like the PRD or maybe the PRFAQs or product roadmap vision documents, stuff like that. The next section, objectives. What do we want to learn? What are we going to do with the results? And I also like to have subsection called non-objectives. Sometimes you might have huge objectives, over broad ones, and you want to scope it down. You want to make sure you align with your team on this first to know, hey, what are we studying and what aren't we going to study? Right? Because a lot of times people are going to have so many questions, they're going to want to be like, bam, ask this, ask this, ask this.
I understand nothing.
But you want to scope it enough so you can have a focus. Okay? So then you might have a section called non-objectives. And say, hey, maybe this could be a different study for later. Okay, that's all right, totally okay. Next, we have research questions. So these are the specific questions pertaining to the product or service. I also have success metrics. There will be metrics you'll be measuring to know whether or not you're on the right track. So typically, if you're running foundational research, there's no real metrics. Okay, there's no we're gonna increase revenue, blah, 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 because you're just building an understanding at that point. So for foundational research, there's not metrics as in numbers. Just keep that in mind. Timeline. Timeline is, exactly what it sounds like. An overview of how long the research activities will take and the deadline for each activity. Usually I keep the DAISY framework along with the timeline. So DAISY is just who's working on what and when. It's really important to include because I've made the mistake once of not actually confirming who's doing what and when, and that actually resulted in the team pushing back on each other and then blaming one another. So yeah, it sounds stupid and trivial. Ooh, process, so much process. I know, process isn't the sexiest thing to talk about. Systems work, and trust me, there's a reason I included it in the study plan template. It's not for you, it's not for us, it's for your team. Something to keep your team up to date on what's going on. Then we also have methods, the methodology section. Right? What methods are you using? You want to describe them here. In this section, you also want to include your participants, your criteria, who you're talking to, materials. Typically I link to any assets or prototypes that is going to be used, and I'll tag my designer, whoever's in charge of those designs. And then finally, we're going to have the procedures, discussion guide, script, aka protocol, whatever, all of that stuff. This is a formal or informal script containing the questions and the exact wording that you're going to use during a study. The procedure is like a cooking recipe. Anyone reading it should know exactly how your study is done, and they're able to replicate it if they wanted to. So that's the study plan for you. Keep in mind, this is a living, breathing document where you and your team should be centralizing your research activities upon. Now, like I said already, this document is more than just a recipe for research, but it's like a home base. Everyone can feel warm and fuzzy because you're all aligned on the same problems. So now that we know the structure of the study plan, let's put this baby to practice. You don't want to miss the next one because we're going to do a real life take-home exercise that I've gotten from a tech company before, a real life interview take home, and we're going to use our study plan to do it. Showing you what goes into a study plan, but how long should it take to create one? As a newbie, it's very easy to want to make the perfect study plan and take hours and hours to do it. But in reality, I never spent more than 2 hours creating one. Of course, when I was newer to the field, it took me a long time. As I got better, as I got more experience, I realized you don't need to spend that much time on it. Not because I'm super smart or anything, it's quite the opposite, but because you don't need the perfect plan to show your stakeholders. After the badass kickoff meeting, we'll have a pretty good idea of the background, the objectives, the non-objectives, the research questions, success metrics, timeline, and probably whom participants we need to speak with. That's plug and play. All you need to do is just take all your notes for your meeting and just plug into the study plan. That shouldn't take you more than like, I don't know, a few minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour probably.
Go, in and out, 20 minutes adventure.
The sections that take the most time are the methods and the discussion guide, aka script, aka protocol, aka procedure. We gotta think about which methods make sense, who we're gonna speak with, how many segments of people do we have, and a sample size for each segment. Then we have to actually write out a discussion guide to help guide our conversations. This goes for qualitative research. If you're doing a survey, you might not be writing a discussion guide per se, you'll be writing your survey questions. The reason I don't take a lot of time on a study plan initially is because I always treat my first draft as a first draft. I treat my first version as a draft. And I'll share that with my team to get feedback and thoughts. And I will make sure when I do share with them that I emphasize and I stress that, hey, it's a draft, it's not finished yet. I want to get your initial look at it to make sure I'm not missing anything or that we're getting second pair of eyes on it, just to see, hey, now it's on paper, do we need to change anything? And that's how you can avoid stressing out about having a perfect study plan. Really, honestly, no lie, I had major imposter syndrome, like writing out study plans because I wanted it to be perfect. But as soon as you think about, hey, this is a draft, it will be better. I'm going to involve my stakeholders throughout this process, so it's almost as if we're writing it together. In fact, I usually write my discussion guide after I get some feedback from my team. When I send the first draft, sometimes I don't even have the discussion guide ready. That way, I don't use up all my energy writing something if it's not even aligned the right way. Also, pro tip for getting feedback, don't just email it to people and say, hey, here's the study plan, leave feedback. People don't usually just open and look through the whole thing, unless they're like really cool, badass partners. What I like to do is send the email, but tag people in specific parts of the plan to review. Therefore, it gives the illusion that you're only asking for something small. When people open it and review the section, they're naturally gonna look over the rest of it, right? Yeah, the more you know. But let's say, for some reason, nobody gives you feedback. Sad. Then just do your best to get a version ready and then pilot your study. I will do, at all costs, I will get feedback from the stakeholders before I even run the study. But if for whatever reason, maybe you're working in a very immature UX practice, people don't have time, they don't really want to, that's a different problem. I would still try to put it in front of them and say, hey, maybe even set up another meeting where you can all synchronously at the same time look at it together. Just do your best to get their feedback before you actually run the study. But I'm just saying, last resort, if you cannot, like let's say everybody on your team dies or something, knock on wood, right? No one dying here today. Let's say everybody is not able to give you feedback. Pilot your study. In other words, do a dry run. Okay, this is the last resort. You're going to do this anyway. Regardless of feedback, you want to do a pilot study. We'll talk about that more, but essentially it's another way to get feedback on whether or not you are getting the right data you expect. So there you have it. A couple of badass UX tips to help you not stress out about your study plan. There's one tip I want to give to you that can help you organize your thoughts in your study plan. This applies to your methodology section, your sampling, and your screeners. So here's what I mean. Let's say you're talking about your methods that you want in your study plan. I want you to create a table in your study plan. It says method. And let's say you're doing interviews, IDIs, as one method and usability as another. In your table, put these methods here. In the next column, I want you to put what you're trying to learn from this method. Questions you want answered. Okay, so for IDIs, it may be understanding backgrounds or attitudes, etc., etc. For usability, you're trying to identify pain points, whether they can complete tasks, etc., etc. And here's another tip. You can also add another column for participants. Right, let's add it to the left. I don't know if you see this, but add it to the left. Sample. Okay, because maybe you want to do IDIs for only certain participants, and for usability you want to do for others. Right? Let's say, for example, usability is for non-users. Non-users. You also want to do IDIs for current users. You might want to run them for both. So you might even, add an extra column, say, for current users and non-users. And you want to specify, I'm sorry for the chicken scratch by the way, but specify what users are doing, what method, and what you want to learn from them. You can also, create a sub row for this. It's like IDIs, also ODIs. For current users, you want specific questions. For non-users, you want specific questions. You see what I mean? Okay, so that's one way to organize your methods and your sample. Now, on the other hand, I want to share with you how to organize your screener questions. We're also going to go with a table kind of format. So on the left column, I'm going to have track. I'll tell you what this means soon. Your screener question goes here. And then the last column is why. So track means, let's say I want everyone to answer a question about their age. Not typically a screener question, that's a demographic profiling question, but let's just pretend for ease, age. Track, I want everyone to answer this. All, okay? And here, why is the purpose. Why are we asking this screener question? And I might call it a screener question, but maybe I'm profiling people. Yeah, I know profile is a negative connotation, but in a way, sometimes we don't want to screen people out for certain questions. We just want a quota of different people. For example, let's say the options for age is 18 to 24, 25, 35, 36 to 45, 46 to 55, and then 56 plus. Whatever, right? Everyone answers this question, and the purpose is to, let's just say, screen out people under 18. Yeah, I want to screen people out under 18. This is the only purpose of this question. So anyone who says under 18, they are out. So if they're not 18, they're older than 18, they can move on to question 2. So question 2, let's say it's an attitudinal one. How willing are you to try fried chicken and waffles? Chicken and waffles. For me, that's an extremely likely. So there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so not at all likely and extremely likely. I hope you can see this, or at least get the idea of what I'm trying to write, because my chicken scratch, fried chicken. Anyway, yeah. So track anyone who says over 18, 18 plus. So anyone who's 18 plus can see this next question. And now, let's say I'm interested in talking to people for my study. I'm interested in talking to people who are at least somewhat open to trying chicken and waffles. Okay, I don't want the people who are not interested at all. So 3, 4, 5, I will accept them. So what I'm trying to do here is screen out people who answer 1 or 2. 1 and 2, okay? So I'm going to keep 3, 4, 5. People who answer 3, 4, 5, I'm going to keep, and they get to see the next question. So let's call this question 1. This is question 2. Now this is question 3. My third screener question, the trap is if they answer to C, to D, and to E, A, B, C, D, E, yeah. And this is messy, but hopefully you're getting my drift here. If they answer 2C, 2D, 2E, they can proceed to this question. Whatever it is, okay? But hopefully this makes sense. So to organize your thoughts in a screener, you can do a similar thing as you would with methods and sampling. So far I'm using questions to screen people out. But I have many times where I'm not trying to screen people, I'm trying to get a quota. So what I'm doing instead is profiling. Profiling or quota. What that means is I'm interested in getting a mix of people who answer different ways in the next question. So what's the next question? I don't know. How likely are you, what are your thoughts about hot sauce? Okay, maybe my study is all about hot sauce and fried chicken and waffles. So in this question could be about hot sauce. Do you like hot sauce or not? Whatever. And I'm interested to talk to people who aren't into hot sauce and also people who are into hot sauce, everything in between. So really the next question is just profiling. I want a mix of people who like hot sauce or don't like hot sauce, and I want to talk to them. So that's the purpose of profiling a quota question. And hopefully, this format helps you organize your thoughts a little bit better. You can add it to your actual study plan. Your audience would actually appreciate that too. It's an easier way to find out why you're asking certain questions. So hopefully that helps.
To illustrate just how important a study plan is, let me tell you a story about something that happened to me at work. So one time, my team and I were planning research to study user onboarding to our platform. We knew that onboarding was not great. Let's just say it's a very small percent of people make it through the initial process. And onboarding is one of those things you have to get right because it sets the tone for the rest of the experience for users. So naturally, I wanted to know how the product prepares or doesn't prepare new users to the platform and why people drop off before trying out the platform. However, as I was planning the research, the design lead, who's been at the company for about 7 years, kept commenting on our research plan. How is it different from previous XYZ research? We have data on blah, we have data on this, etc., etc. I've gone through the previous research, right? And there had to be a reason why we're doing this new research. But I started second guessing whether or not we needed this research because the design lead kept asking these questions. And then my PM also started second guessing the research. Like, do we even need this now? So even though I had already planned the research, this doubt was killing me. So the PM, designer, and we sat together again and we're like, hey, let's talk about it. Let's talk it out. Let's play devil's advocate. Let's pick this research apart. Do we really need it? And I really had to think, what is it that we don't know about our users yet? What were the limitations of the previous research? What gaps do we need to fill in here? What does the designer need to know in order to start designing a better experience? Eventually, we did the research by looking at non-users and their expectations around the platform. And it turned out to be useful, because the previous research all had been done within the platform, with our current users, stuff like that. The point of the story is not the research study that I did, right? That's not the point of the story is this. If you can't convince yourself, don't expect to be convincing anybody else. And if you aren't sure about your research questions and why you're doing it, then be sure. Get your stakeholders in a room, just jam on it. It's better to not know before the research than to not know while you're conducting the research. And the other thing I want to point out, if you work at a place where people have been on the team for a long time, they're going to reference previous research. They have a lot of institutional knowledge. They're going to be like, oh, we already had this. We know this. And you need to start considering how the previous research was done. You need to look at how the methodology is run, who it was run on, when it was done, because the product may have changed a lot. What questions were they asking? Were they asking the same questions? Maybe some of the findings are applicable, and great. If they are, you save some time. That's perfect. I would rather have that. But chances are your product has changed over time, and you know what? Yeah, we have research from the past, but we're still seeing the same problem. It still hasn't been fixed. So,
Anyway, that was a quick little detour to show you the realities of study planning. Not everything's going to be smooth like butter. So if you're not sure, it's okay. Take the extra meeting. Don't just jump into the research if you're not sure. If you're not sure as the researcher, that's not good. So be sure, ask your stakeholders, ask them again, and just go in it like, hey, you know what? I've been thinking. Can I align with y'all? I want to clarify. Is this what we're studying? We have this data here. What do we think about that, right? What do we think about this previous research? Why can't we use this research right now? And go in it with an open mind. That's how you can do research with intention. In this lesson, I want to give you a very simple framework in which to think more purposefully about your research questions. The reason being, we don't want to just ask questions for the hell of it without thinking why we're actually asking these questions. Otherwise, our research will be all over the place. Again, harking back to the importance of having clear objectives, which can be attained by aligning with your stakeholder team. Anyway, here it is. I don't have a sexy name for it or anything. We can start with building out a table with 3 columns. First column, who are we learning from? The second column is just your research question. And then the third column, probably the most important one, is why you're asking this question. What do you expect to do with this information? I found this table helps structure our questions a bit better. The who column is easy, it's your target audience, but you might have multiple target criteria, like current users or ex-users or users who dropped off in the middle of your process. And you wouldn't ask the same questions to everybody. Next, column 2, which is questions. This is pretty obvious, just put your research questions in here. And finally, the last column is why we're asking and what we expect. And this helps us stay focused. A lot of my students ask a question like, how many people click X or click Y? Or how often do users check the app, blah, blah, blah. And I remind them, qualitative research won't tell you this information. Think about what kind of questions you're asking and whether or not you need qualitative research to get it, or can you refer to analytics to get those answers? So how many people click on blah? If you're recruiting 5, 6, 7, or 8 participants, that's not gonna give you the information you need. That's not what qualitative research is for. How many people click on blah? That's analytics. Now, if you have a prototype and it's not live, how many people click on blah is not a valid question because you don't have the data. Does that make sense? We can ask it to our participants, but what they answer isn't important. In qualitative research, it's why that's more important for us to understand. And to take it a step further, we then anticipate what information we expect to get. Think to the future. What possible answers could you get? And think about how you're going to use that information. Kind of like the pre-mortem I talked about in the previous lesson. This framework then is a great way to organize and structure our study plan. So start including this in your study plans. One very interesting question I got from a student of mine was, how much domain knowledge do I need to approach a research session? This is a really good question because some people say you need to be an expert. And in fact, one time I interviewed for a TV entertainment company and they said, we're looking for someone with TV experience. And I said, well, I've been watching TV my whole life. So anyway, they didn't take me. They said they wanted someone who knew the industry. Fair enough, but catch-22, am I right? How are you supposed to get experience without the experience? And I think watching TV as a consumer is experience. But anyway, besides myself, I don't think you need to be an expert in a certain domain. But I think you should have enough domain knowledge. So the industry jargon, for example, you got to know what previous research exists about it and the processes. Why? Because we don't want to waste time asking the obvious questions, right? We want to get to the main objectives. We don't want to spend so much time doing the build up and building up our own knowledge so that we can converse on the same level as our participants. We don't need to be an expert, but we have to know the basics, the baseline, so that we don't duplicate research, so that we know who our competitors are and how we stack up, so that we can understand what the participant is actually talking about, so that we can actually probe and know what to probe on and what they're talking about, and also can be taken seriously. Here's an example of one industry that I worked in where we were required to understand the jargon. And this was when I was working at Uber Freight. So as a lead researcher there, I needed to know what terms were used in the freight industry, what they mean and how it worked. If I didn't, there's no way I could actually research participants, because I would ask them, oh, what do you mean by LTL? What do you mean by BOL, POD? I'm like, you should know this, right? And that's not the research that we're interested in. We don't care what BOL means. So I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to waste time asking stupid questions. If I didn't understand the jargon, I wouldn't know what's important or not. I wouldn't know what to ask or probe on, and I wouldn't be taken seriously. So in certain industries where you're new to it, learn the jargon. So what happened when I was at Uber Freight, we had to learn all these terms. And we had a orientation, we had a training meeting where we were tested on all these terms. It was really cool. I learned a lot about the freight industry. And one of the reasons why we were trained on these terminologies was because a lot of us were not working in the freight industry, and we were talking to people, truck drivers, dispatchers, fleet managers, and they knew the freight industry very well. So when they're talking to someone from a tech company, they're not going to take you seriously unless you understood the language. So I would argue that not having extensive knowledge, but at least a baseline knowledge or language, right? You got to share the same language as a baseline, but you don't have to have the expertise in the domain. This gives you an advantage because this gives you a fresh outsider's perspective on approaching a problem, while others may already have preconceived notions, right? When I was working in the freight industry, everyone's in antiquated methods, right? Paper, they still use a lot of paper tracking. The sentiment is this is how it's always been. It's hard to change if you don't speak the same language. So if you don't know the domain, that's okay. If you're interested, do the research, learn about it. It's very interesting to learn more about anything in general, right? That's the advantage of not knowing. Approach everything with curiosity. And that's my 2 cents.
Believe it or not, a form of being a badass UX researcher is including your stakeholders during your research. Mindset. Beyond that, including them throughout your research. It's the team's research, not just yours. My philosophy is, by the time I come out with the research, nothing should be a surprise. But the point is, I want you to put this philosophy into practice. We spoke about what to do before your sessions. Now let's talk about how to involve stakeholders during your sessions. The best practice is to set expectations and ground rules before the call and get a designated person to field the questions for you. But things happen, such as stakeholders didn't read your discussion guide. Stakeholders invited others to join, which is great, but they might not know the ground rules. If that happens, it may manifest itself into a not so smooth session.
Okay, let's establish some ground rules, pretty boy.
So here are 3 real life situations I come across a lot, and I want you to think about how you might approach them. And after I say them, pause the video and think about what you might do. Brainstorm with a buddy if you want to, and in the next lesson, we'll go over some possible answers. Here's the first scenario. Imagine you're conducting a remote interview over Zoom with a participant. You have 5 other teammates join remotely as well. One stakeholder forgets to mute their microphone, and another forgot to turn their camera off. What do you do? Second scenario. Imagine you're conducting a remote interview with a participant. Okay? A stakeholder is watching and then pings and messages multiple questions to ask the participant, some of which you're gonna get to eventually. Okay, so they're pinging you a lot. Hey, ask this, ask that. What do you do? Third scenario, imagine you're conducting a remote interview over Zoom with a participant. Again, remote interview. A stakeholder has a question and suddenly unmutes themselves and asks the participant directly.
Marty, did you ever go to school and have those thermos? You know what I'm talking about? A thermos?
Thermals.
No, a thermos.
Thermals.
No, a
shirts.
thermos.
What do you do? All right, and to think these are just a few examples. In fact, if you're lucky, you might even encounter all 3 of them in the same session.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
I'm just kidding, that's not lucky. So think about how you might approach them, then we'll chat about it in the next lesson. I posed 3 real-life situations that come up during a call where it will require us, as moderators, to juggle many things at once. For those of you badass UX leaders who took the time to think about it, good job! Now let's go over scenario 1, where teammates join a call with their microphones and cameras on. Don't call anyone out over the video call.
You're fired.
just politely remind people to turn their microphone and cameras off.
Oh, right. You're on fire. I need you. Come here.
And use this opportunity to introduce the participant to your observers so it's not awkward. If you didn't do that already, say something like, so we have Jin, May, Alex, Encore, Peter on the line, and let them say hi. They're part of the team and we'll be just taking notes, no right or wrong answers. It's the prototype, not you, blah, blah, blah. And I might relay some of their questions to you, so I'll have them chat me. In the second scenario, we have a very eager and curious stakeholder with lots of questions.
Are we there yet?
No!
Are we there yet? No, we are not. Are we there yet?
No!
So I've asked my masterclass students before, and some of them gave me really good answers. But some people said we should ignore the stakeholder and focus on the participant. Don't ignore the stakeholder, message them back, acknowledging their question, and you'll get to it when appropriate. Otherwise, they might get frustrated and think you're ignoring them.
Lewis! 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 Mom! Mom!
In some cases, stakeholders might have joined the call late and missed earlier questions, okay? And we don't want them to think you're ignoring them. They might even unmute themselves and ask the participant directly. So here's a few phrases you can type back to them. Got it, sounds good. Gonna ask soon. Sounds good to me, I'll cover it later. Already covered. We'll debrief with you later. Or thanks, I'll circle back later. Or simply send them a thumbs up emoji. Basically some indicator to let them know that you see them. And make sure to reward their questions in a non-leading way. Finally, in the case of stakeholders gone wild, scenario 3, we have someone who just unmutes and asks the participant something directly.
But the incidence was dramatically...
Sure. In India, 2 + 2 = 5 there, right?
Oh, well, at this point, what are you gonna do? Cut them off? Just let them finish and see what the participant says.
Excuse me, miss. Do you have cancer?
If it was a leading question, maybe reword it and try to re-ask the question again. I'll admit, even if it's a bad question, sometimes participants may respond in a different angle where we didn't expect. So here's where we can take advantage of that and probe more deeply. So sometimes you might have a leading question, they still answer, maybe it's a good jumping off point. Now, to prevent the stakeholder from doing it again, ping them privately and politely ask them to relay the question to you first. Hey stakeholder, thanks for the question. I'm happy to relay your questions to the participant. That way we can keep the session running smoothly. At the end of the call, I can open up the room for you if you like. So be prepared for such situations and handle it diplomatically like a badass UX leader. Remember, you are the research expert, you are in control.
As UX researchers, we don't only deliver findings. We must provide actionable insights and sound recommendations. And findings are the what. Insights are the so what, and recommendations are the now what. But we should be careful how we word our recommendations, else they might end up sounding bad or even ugly. So what's the difference between a good recommendation and a bad one? Well, a recommendation should be based on data and gives direction on what changes need to be made, but it shouldn't give the actual change to be made unless it's super obvious. So let's take a look at what factors make a good recommendation. Well, it has to be data-driven or backed by evidence. The recommendation ties directly back to the user needs and the pain points. It also describes opportunity, and sometimes you might have opportunities to address multiple unmet needs and look at the bigger picture. Sure, it's great, and it's very normal to just recommend one thing for one problem. But if you can come up with a bigger picture and say, hey, here's one recommendation, and it can, sorry birds, but it can kill multiple birds with one stone.
How dare you!
It also has to be feasible. If you recommend creating a spaceship to outer space with VR tech to address, a cooking process, that's not very feasible. Just making something up, but it has to be realistic to technical constraints. And I'm not saying don't make kind of blue sky recommendations. And by blue sky, I mean things to think outside the box. So recommendations has to be doable within reason. We have to also think about the next factor, which is priorities. yes, you can have blue sky recommendations and your team might be all aligned with it, but it might take months, even years to get to that recommendation. That's a different priority compared to, hey, we are losing users left and right every single day. We got to do something now. That's a different kind of priority. So prioritize based on the impact to your users, to your business, your severity, prevalence, frequency. You can't just give a list of recommendations to your stakeholders because they're going to ask you, what should we focus on first? From your UX research, badass UX leader expertise, where should we focus our efforts first? And sometimes that might have to come from a discussion with your team. What you can do, what we can do is give a recommended priority. Hey, based on what we've learned from user research, here's what we recommend. Marketing team has some other data. Analytics team might have other data that say otherwise. And then we'll work together as a product team, as a unit to determine what the priorities should be. We'll talk about prioritization in a later module where we have some frameworks to internally and also externally prioritize stuff. All right, next. A recommendation doesn't blame the user.
Don't blame me, blame your mother.
Okay, so don't blame anybody. It can't be too specific nor too broad. Okay, I know that one doesn't help a lot, but for obvious problems, you can be specific. It's like, all right, this is a clear issue. This is an easy fix.
Don't freak out. Don't freak out. Easy fix. Puzzle code in my head.
For everything else, we might want to provide direction, but without giving too much specificity to it. So we'll practice with some practice problems soon to give you an idea of what that means. But it varies case by case. That's why a factor that it can't be too specific and it can't be too broad for certain contexts.
And last but not least,
a recommendation has to be concise. If you're recommending something, just give the recommendation. When you add too much context, that should belong in the context, right? When you present your research findings, you present all your findings, and then you have a dedicated section, and usually I color in a different font. I even put a box around it. Here's my recommendation. It lives alone, but it ties back to the insights, ties back to the needs, and why I'm recommending this recommendation. So don't add too much context. Don't add the explanation to your recommendation. That should just be separate, like one sentence for your recommendation. All right, on the other hand, what makes a poor recommendation? Obviously, kind of the opposite of everything I mentioned just now, but here's some factors that make it a poor recommendation. It's too solution or feature focused. Some findings can have multiple solutions, but if you give only one possible solution, you're limiting your team, you're kind of pigeonholing them to only think about that, and that makes a bad recommendation. Instead, what we want to do is brainstorm together instead of just saying one thing. We'll go through some examples of that. A poor recommendation is also not data-driven. It's based on assumptions. It's based on only attitudinal data and not any observed behavior. Sometimes your participants might give you great ideas. It's like, oh, that's actually a great recommendation. I think that would work. And your stakeholders, they were listening in on the call and they thought, wow, that participant's suggestion is really great. So let's just do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
That's not a bad recommendation, but what you want to say instead of, hey, we recommend what the participant told us, instead what you want to say is, a participant suggested doing this. Let's open up this discussion for that. How might we, bring that to life? How might we actually dig to go into the root problem of why this was suggested? Another poor recommendation, this might be a very common one in academia, which is more research is needed. Now, this is great for exploring new topics. If you identified some new topics at some new themes that your team doesn't really understand yet, great, let's explore more. But if you set out to answer a question and you couldn't really answer it with your research, and your recommendation is, oh, we need to do more research, then we might have to go back and look at our scope. Our project scope might have been too big, or maybe we didn't probe enough. Maybe we didn't understand the deeper insights too well. So it's useful as a means to explore new identified themes. But if you're going after a specific research question or objective, we better have some good actual recommendations for our team. Otherwise, it's going to end up being another kind of, hey, UX research wasn't very effective conversation. And last but not least,
And finally, last but not least,
a poor recommendation blames the user. You finish your presentation. Yay! Throw those high fives, round of applause, and get celebrating. Unless you were super nervous and fainted during your presentation 2 minutes in and bombed it, in which case, let's go hide in the corner together. Psych! We're badass UX leaders. We ain't doing that. No judgment if you do. Anyway, after the presentation, we're close to wrapping up our study, but we're not done yet.
So close.
In this lesson, you'll learn a few quick steps to take that will ensure your insights get actioned on. First things first, you're gonna write up a summary of your discussion points and action items. And this is discussion points from your actual meeting, from your presentation with everybody who aligned on it. This is because not everybody is probably gonna be able to attend your meeting. So the point is to summarize the main takeaways and next steps so your team is in the loop. And if your team ended up with more questions than answers, that's good. Remind your team that that's a good thing, and we can start planning the next steps for digging deeper. And just because we finished our presentation doesn't mean we're done with our research communication. The best UX leaders maintain proactive relationship with stakeholders and track impact. Say you identified usability problems with your product. Don't just read your report and expect your stakeholders to take action. If they do, great, okay? Great, keep them for a long time. But if they don't, which has happened to me, do it for them. Go on Jira, Trello, Airtable, Confluence, wherever your project management tool is that your team uses, or any kind of simple spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be a fancy tool. Like Google Spreadsheet works well, and I talked about this in a previous video before. Create those tickets, create those lines of items to track them, and assign stakeholders to their tickets. If one way doesn't work, try presenting your recommendations in a different format, like in a very findings-oriented spreadsheet. Remember the previous lesson? I refer back to the earlier lesson on when to use which report format and the time I had to switch report formats. When you're done with that, keep up those one-on-one meetings with your partners to see how the project is progressing, how the action items are being played out. This is key to amplifying yourself as a proactive, badass UX leader. And in Module 10, I think Module 10, I'll talk about more things we can track, how to track them, and how to achieve high impact in our work.
Miro has a set of AI tools, including generating mind maps, user stories, images, and other things, and I'll post a link to the Help Center page in the video description. The AI tool is available to everyone, which is great, even the free plan, but you have to be signed in, so you have to have an account. In this lesson, I'm going to share my experiences with the AI tool for analysis. Then we're going to practice using the AI for analysis with the same kitchen renovation dataset as the previous lesson. The reason I'm showing Miro AI is because, well, Miro is currently one of the most common collaborative tools researchers use for analysis, besides maybe Dovetail. But who knows, in a few years, another tool will pop up integrating AI in it. AI evolves so quickly that the tips I show you today might be different tomorrow.
Okie doke, so I've set up this Miro board with our 3 participants here. P1 I've color coded as green, P2 is yellow, and P3 is blue. Set up an identical one using our same fake data set. And the way you have to do this, if you want sticky notes, right? If you want these little posty sticky notes to move around, you have to paste it from like a spreadsheet tool. If you paste it from the Google Doc that I gave you, it will just paste as, you know, text. So you have to transfer it over here first, or at least this is the way I figured it out, right? You have to transfer it over into some spreadsheet or table tool, and then paste it. And it'll ask, Miro asks you, do you want to paste as table or paste as sticky note? We want sticky notes because we can move them around. If you paste as table, it's just gonna, you know, give you the spreadsheet. So let's get rid of that and paste as sticky notes instead. Now you'll notice in relation to the the actual setup that I have, these are super tiny. Miro does that sometimes. I think this is their default size, and I've just made everything bigger. But yeah, just know that you might have to go hunting for it sometimes. Now that we've set this up, you will see that this is just our participants' quotes, not in any order or arrangement. In other words, unclustered, unorganized data, ripe for our affinity diagramming. Now, I have had my live masterclass students run an experiment. And the question is, how does human analysis compare to AI clustering? More specifically, Miro AI clustering. Now, before I go any further, I want to say as of this recording, the Miro AI is still in beta. AI is always evolving and getting better. So what you see today may be different in a few months. Maybe they've gotten super good in a few months. So keep that in mind. I've had my live masterclass run an experiment. First, I have them make 2 copies of the original data. And this is just the academic researcher habit in me, which is I never touch the raw data. I just make copies of it, and I'll do the analysis in it, and then kind of keep track. So first set is your data, then make 2 copies. The first copy, I want you to do analysis by hand. Do your affinity diagram by hand. And I want you to find your own themes. Then, in the second one, run the analysis with the Miro AI only. At that point, compare how your themes compare to the AI themes. And then you could be done. But I want you to take one step further. After you've done the hand analysis, make a copy of that, and then run the Miro AI on it. So rather than just running the Miro AI right away, you're going to do the hand analysis and then make a copy of it and then run the AI on it. In my opinion, I believe the human plus AI path is the most useful result, as it summarized and allowed for a different perspective on the story. And that's what I recommend doing as well. Since this lesson isn't about having you doing analysis by hand, I'm not going to force you to do it. But bonus badass points if you do, because perfect practice makes perfect. Not that much data anyway. And if you want, you can do a co-synthesis with the buddy, make it a little faster. But yeah, you're going to see why the human plus AI approach is superb. So don't be lazy. Practice. All right, so create your own Miro board with the exact same setup. And here's how you do it in Miro AI. Kind of simple. So let's go over here. We're going to apply to Miro AI only. Highlight all your sticky notes. And this is the icon you're looking for, Miro AI. So it's this blue star icon. And you can summarize the data. You can cluster by keywords, cluster by sentiment. I believe there's another option where you could cluster by tags. Oh, cluster objects. Oh yeah, you can cluster by color, tag, authors, keywords, or sentiment. In fact, you don't even have to use the AI button. You can just go straight here to cluster objects, which they've always had. But yeah, as you can see, the beta is the AI, sentiment is AI. Color tag, if you've tagged it, if you have any other color coding schemes, then you can cluster by that too. But let's try the first option, which is summarize. It's going to give you one sticky note. Let me make this bigger. It's going to try to summarize all your sticky notes, which in this case, it doesn't really make sense because we have 3 different participants with 3 different needs and 3 different motivations, and it's going to summarize into one. Couple renovates farmhouse style home, gathers inspiration from online resources, and tracks budget on Google Sheets. Now, if you read all the quotes from the participants, our fake participants, you'll realize that this sticky note only applies to participant 1. It doesn't summarize participant 2 or 3, but you notice I highlighted all of them and only summarized participant 1. So it's not correct. I don't know what it's doing in the back end, but let's try it again. Retired couple, so retired couple refers to participant 3, not participant 1 or 2. So yeah, it's not exactly correct. Let's see. Let me just grab like 1.5 of it too and see if it does something. We're just doing live here, right? I'm not scripting this. Just seeing what the AI does. All right, first summary was about P1. Second summary with retired couple. This is about third participant. And then, okay, again, retired couple. Participant 1 and 2 are not retired. It was only participant 3. So these summaries are not correct. In my experience, I've never found the summary AI to work very well, so I don't even use it. Maybe it'll get better. So ignore the summary for now. You can summarize better, I'm sure. Let's try clustering by keywords. What happens is Miro would generate a clusters with black boxes around it, and you can treat these as possible emergent themes. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so the first thing is it went kind of outside our frame. You can make the frame fit it, or you can kind of put these over here. And you notice that I dragged the black title. It took me forever to realize that you had to click this to drag the whole set. Or I kept trying to like drag this. Sorry, I kept trying to do this, but it wouldn't do it. So you have to actually drag it by the black title. Okay, so let's do that first. After every AI result, my recommendation for you is to always look at it, check it. Don't take it at face value. It's pretty neat that the AI can, all you have to do is click a button and it clusters things maybe 60% of the way. You'll notice compared to the human analysis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. This one's not clustered yet, but 5 clusters. And here we have 2, 3. We have a lot more than 5. Right? There's 11 clusters. The question is, what is going to be the most useful way for you to analyze your data? What's the most useful story you can tell from your data? For that, you go back to your research questions, your main objectives. What are you trying to extract from your analysis? What you can do also with the AI tool is first cluster by keywords, and then you can apply cluster by sentiment. But before you do that, and again, I mentioned my researcher habit, which is always make a copy before you do something, and then apply sentiment. I don't think so. What I imagine this will do, so they're clustered by keyword, and this cluster only has 2 sticky notes, right? I don't think there's going to be much insight drawn from that. If you try to apply the cluster by sentiment to everything, it's just going to treat it as one bunch, almost like clustering this set here. So it's not very useful. What you could do is take a cluster and then further cluster by sentiment. So let's apply only there, right? It's going to take your theme or your emergent theme or possible theme and then cluster by sentiment. So that's pretty useful, I think. Find some main clusters and then further cluster by sentiment, which I think is pretty cool. So let's try it with this bigger group too. Highlight that, cluster by sentiment, boom. Okay, well, it got in the way over here, but there you go. Create some sentiments, create some new black frames around it. Sometimes I don't fully agree with the clustering Miro AI does, so you can undo it or just drag the stickies where you think makes most sense. The takeaway I want you to get from here is try comparing the data that you get versus Miro AI only, and then try applying AI to your human analysis to see if you can extract a different perspective. Maybe the AI can give you a different perspective on the data, which I think is probably the most useful use case of AI in analysis. And when I mention AI, I'm specifically talking about Miro AI. It's a very common tool to use, so yeah. And there you go. That's data analysis using Miro AI. Saves us a bit of time, or at worst provides us some different perspectives that we can approach our data with and our story. Again, at the end of the day, AI results, any tools that you use, treat it as a starting point. Don't take it at face value. Use it to augment yourself as a badass UX leader. Don't use it to replace our work.
But if you have additional tips or questions about analysis using Miro, let me know.
Empathy map? Redundant? What? But Nielsen Norman Group says... I'm going to tell you in this lesson why empathy maps are useless and redundant, and why I've never made one and don't plan to. And I don't just say this because I want to be controversial. I say this because I've given it a fair chance. I've tried to find a use for it, but honestly, they're redundant. And I'll explain why in this next lesson also. The deliverable that makes this redundant is the user journey map. But in this lesson, we're just talking about the empathy map. So let's start off with what is it? What is an empathy map? Well, here you can see that it takes 4 elements of what a user says, thinks, does, and feel. Right? What are their quotes? What are they thinking? What are they planning? What do they do? What are their behaviors? And their emotions. How are they feeling? And you map that out into this quadrant, and you show your stakeholders, here's the empathy map, to have them build empathy with your user. My honest opinion, again, you know my opinion, it's redundant. And the reason for that is that if you do the generative or foundational research, you're going to come up with the same information, the same data that you could use to produce a user journey map, which I argue is much more useful, is way better visualized, more actionable than an empathy map. So why have an empathy map at all? To me, it's duplicate data, and you're just creating a deliverable that is just for the sake of creating another deliverable, which is not going to be very useful. I've never made a formal empathy map. My stakeholders have never asked me for one, and they've never needed an empathy map, and I don't plan to. Here's a message exchange with one of my alumni who works at a large retail company as a UX researcher. They told me that their company really values it, journey maps and empathy maps, and I asked them, oh, how do you use empathy maps? And this was the response. Honestly, I find empathy maps useless. My director requested persona journey map and empathy map, and it felt redundant, to be honest. So don't just take it from me. This is a real researcher working at a large company, also finding it useless. So my advice, you don't need it. Don't waste your time with empathy maps. What you do want to spend your time on instead is user journey map. All right, lovely researchers, let's do a pop quiz in this lesson. Let's start off with this question. Let's say you conducted a study with 6 participants and something occurs with 2 of them. All right, doesn't matter what the study is, doesn't matter what you found. What I want to know is, what do you report? Okay. A, 33%, B, 2 of 6, C, a few, or D, 1/3. Let you think about this for a second. 2 of 6 participants, you saw something. What do you report? Now if you said B, you'd be correct. I would also give credit if you said C, if you said a few, and we'll talk about why in a second. But let's try 2 more of these questions. All right. Let's say you did a study with 20 participants. Well, what do you report here? Do you report 40%, 8 of 20, or some? If you said B or C, I'd give you that. Let's try one more. How about this one? 10 participants, all 10 people will observe something. A, 100%, B, 10 of 10, or C, all. Alright, it's B or C. B or C are okay with me, just not the percentages. Now, in this lesson, I wanted to talk about how do you actually report small sample size numbers. Okay? Reporting percentages with small sample sizes is misleading. Reporting percentages with small sample sizes, especially less than 30, is misleading. We can reference the central limit theorem for the reason here. I'm not going to cover that, but you can definitely look that up. Central limit theorem. Basically the rule of thumb for when you can start doing percentages or a lot of statistics power is kind of a minimum size of 30. That doesn't apply to every scenario, of course, but that's kind of just your packet of napkin rule of thumb. Sample size less than 30, don't use percentages. Now what do you report? Now you notice how there are alternatives to using numbers, raw numbers. You can also use words. For example, if we had a sample size of 8 And depending on how many people observed or experienced something, this is how you could translate or label these numbers into words. Now, first, before I go into this is a hotly debated topic. There's many discussions. A lot of researchers will live and die by one way, and others don't really care. I've experienced both of them, and across many stakeholders, I think I've found a good way, a good compromise to not piss anyone off, and also to remain clear and not confusing. So let's walk through this table first. If no participants, you could just say none or 0. 1 person, then you could say 1. 2 or 3, I would say few. If it's 4 out of 8, then it's exactly half. 5 to 6 people out of 8, I would say some participants. And if it was 7 out of 8, I would say most participants. You can also use many when it gets to kind of that 6 to 7 range, but let's keep it simple. And obviously, if 8 out of 8, you could say all. Let's try a different sample size. 20. Okay, 20 people. This is how I kind of break it down. Now, this isn't a science. This is more up to your discretion, but just don't be misleading. So 0, same thing. It's none. 1 to 4 participants out of 20. I would say a few. 5 to 8, I'd say several. 9 to 11, about half. 12 to 16, I would use the word some. 17 to 19, I would use many or most participants did this. And then 20, obviously, would be all. Now, my takeaways from the many years and working with many stakeholders, here's what I recommend. Do use the raw number or the absolute number and focus on the insights. If you are going to use the number, the left column version of it, do include the number even if you use the quantity term, so the English word of it. So if you use the word, I would also include the number, because a few could mean 2 to 3 to me, but a few could be perceived as something else to someone else. So it's very important to also include the number. Now, whether that's in a footnote, a small italics, or gray text, or just right at the end of your sentence, it doesn't matter as long as you have it somewhere for people to reference it. The reason I do this is because when I tell the story of small sample sizes, I don't want my stakeholders to focus on the numbers. I don't want them to focus on the numbers. I want them to focus on the insights, the qualitative portion of my research. And this applies to small sample sizes, okay? So if I'm doing 10 participants, anything less than 30, 20-ish, then I will use the word most participants did this, and we saw that. And here's why. I want to guide them away from the numbers and focus on the qualitative insights. Here, obviously, I don't want you to use percentages if your sample size is less than 30. Okay, so remember these key ways to report small sample sizes. And here's just a note on reporting numbers in general. Let's say we do have a sample size larger than 30. If you do report the percentage, I would also recommend including the confidence interval and your sample size as well. So mention your sample size, your n equals blah, your confidence interval, your CI, and that's the safest thing to do. We're going to cover confidence interval later in the stats and the quant module, but just keep that in mind. Keep this term ready for later. And since we're talking about qualitative studies, I had a few words I want to talk about the prevalence of usability issues. When you're conducting a usability test with, let's say, 5 to 8 participants, the real life observed prevalence or the rate of your observed issue may be significantly higher, but your stakeholders might not believe it. And then we have a question about frequency and impact or severity. So we have 3 questions we talked about in the previous lesson. This is prevalence, severity, what did I say? Frequency, prevalence, severity. Severity is the impact on your user, is whether it's going to be positive or negative impact. Prevalence is how many users, and frequency is how often participants are going to see this issue. So the question to ask ourselves is, how critical is this problem? If your answer to all of that is yes, 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 it is severe, it's prevalent, and it's frequent, it's a high priority issue. And so we get into the realm of prioritization of our issues. And that's a really important thing to do too. We don't want to just report our findings, we want to report the priority of our findings as well. Because, think about it, if it's if your product is a hand warmer for using a cell phone, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anyone's gonna die if those gloves aren't gonna work for your cell phone. But on the other hand, if an issue accidentally leads to people deleting their personal data off of their account, that's an issue that you want to be certain fewer people will screw up. In fact, you probably want 0 people to screw that up. Right? This is a more severe issue. Essentially, when talking about usability issues or any issues in general, we have to tie it back to the business implications, user implications, set the context for our audience, for our stakeholders. The exact numbers, again, for a small sample anything study is less important than the severity of the issues. So this is the classic debate between quantitative data and qualitative data. They don't work against each other, they work together. They should work in tandem, in harmony, to provide more context for one or the other. So when you're doing small sample size studies, focus on that qualitative aspect when you're telling the story. Just like I mentioned, when I report my research, I want to guide my stakeholders away from the numbers when it's a small sample study. I don't want them to focus on a number, I want them to focus on the issues and the stories.